All right, hello, and welcome to this edition of Your Health, Your Wealth. I'm your host, Dr. Eddie Patton, and in this episode, we are going to talk about brain development and focus a lot on teens and adolescents. And I have to be honest with you, having three young kids, my oldest is 17. When I first started thinking about brain development and how to deal with teenagers and adolescents nowadays, I really dove into studying brain development to help me understand a little bit better about how the brain develops and why we think in different ways throughout our life. And I first did a lecture on this. I looked back through my Rolodex of lectures I think it was in 2019, so over 6 years ago. And since then, we have certainly gotten a lot more information on brain development, but with the increased use of social media and everything else, I think this topic would be important, not just for even teens to understand, but it's important for everybody. Parents to understand, teachers to understand that the brain is essentially different in different points of your life. The adolescent brain, the teenage brain is very different from the adult brain. And if we understand that, it can help us to rationalize or understand some of the decision making that goes on throughout different points. So lock in, and I hope this episode will help you understand a little bit better about why teens, adolescents make some of the decisions that they make. The first thing I want to highlight is just that, your brain is a static thing. I remember years ago, the thought was that, once you have all your brain cells develop, that no more develop, and that's it. It's kind of like that commercial. This is your brain, and this is your brain on drugs, and they fry the egg, and that's it. But the reality is that there's a term called neuroplasticity, which means that the brain continues to develop and change and evolve throughout our lives. I mean, all the way until we pass away, so 90, 100 years old. And knowing that, that is why it's important that we highlight not just the teens, but throughout our lives, that things that we put into our bodies, things that we consume, vaping, alcohol, drugs, and even positive things like increased sleep and nutrients, B vitamins, vitamin E, they all affect our brain and how our brain evolves and changes. So hopefully you'll learn a little bit about the science about that. We'll talk about some practical tips and some ways to build a little empathy now, understanding this about kind of how we think throughout different points of our lives. So when we think about, and I'll focus on the adolescent teenage years, selfishly, because this is where our kids are right now. And trust me, I am fighting hard to figure them out every single day. So I sometimes go back to this train of thought, like, okay, slow down. This is why they think like they do. But our brain develops from the back to the front. And by that, I mean that the amygdala and these certain areas of the brain that developed first. If you think back to like hunter and gathering days, years ago, when the biggest thing was just to survive. So it was about instincts. That part of the brain, it was about emotions and instinct and knowing what to do if something were to jump out of the bush that's trying to kill you. So that part of the brain evolved first, and in our development, it evolves first. That's why babies are more emotional. They cry easy. If they're hungry, they cry because of emotions and so forth. Then later on, as we developed into more communities, coming together, farming, that is where the higher order reasoning skills really came in. So there's an area of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for impulse control, planning, managing emotions, and so forth. And if there are a few things you can take away from this will be one of them. The prefrontal cortex, the frontal cortex of the brain, is the last to mature. and it doesn't mature until usually around your mid-20s. So even though at 18, and trust you, my 17-year-old that just had a birthday last week, she reminds me all the time that next year she'll be an adult. I'm like, really? Okay. So even though, you've reached this milestone in your age, the brain does not fully develop until like 25, mid-20s. And again, this part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex and the frontal cortex, is the one that controls impulse control, planning, managing emotions. So why are teenagers and kids so emotional and respond so quickly when someone breaks up with them or someone doesn't like them on their Instagram or social media, or someone unfollows their video? Why, as an adult, we say, what the heck, who cares? As opposed to a teenager or adolescent who may think it's the end of the world. That is because their brain is largely driven by their emotional centers, as opposed to the part of the brain that really comes in that deals with impulse control and managing emotion. That part hasn't even developed yet. Adolescence is a time in the brain where you have a lot of what's called rewiring and synaptic pruning. And aside from infancy, adolescence is the time where the brain goes through the most changes. So by pruning, that means you're getting rid of neural connections that you don't really need. And rewiring means that there are brain connections that are being formed. So this process really fine-tunes your adult brain, and it's essential for teens, and is why teens are more sensitive to experiences and learning. So how do we learn in different stages? So largely, adults learn by drawing on their past experiences. Adults learn based on their goals and progress. It's kind of like that statement, fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice, shame on you. You have this whole repertoire that you've built up over your life. There's a lot of memory that comes in. And by adulthood, your memory through a whole circuit within the brain is largely linked to your emotional center. So I can remember you and remember what you did to me years ago. And that doesn't mean that I have to react violently or whatever. But it does set off memories that says, hey, you may want to be careful about this individual, or you may want to be careful about this process. So adults learn from repetition and reflection back. And sometimes you do have to go through things. I often tell people, there's two ways you can learn. And I remember growing up, if the eye of the stove was red, your parents would say, hey, that's hot. Don't touch it. Now, some people can learn from that and learn from the experiences of others to say, all right, I'm not going to touch this. It looks red. It looks fiery. It looks hot. I've been told that it's hot and it'll burn me. But there's some people who just say, you know what? I got to experience it for myself. I'm just going to touch it and see if it's hot. And they do. And then guess what? Now you remember. And so for the rest of your life, that if the eye of the stove is hot, okay, don't touch it. So that is how our brain and our circuitry linked to emotion works. Now, teens are more sensation-seeking, reward-driven. The dopamine system is really kicked in. They learn based on emotions, and they learn based on their environment. So it's very important during the adolescent teenage years that we're in the right environment. And that is why these are more emotional, and why you see things like this high rise in depression, the high rise in suicidality and suicide, because our teens and adolescents don't know how to manage their emotions and know how to manage their environment. So we have to take that into account and make sure that, as adults, And as parents, as school teachers, as anyone that has impact and influence over the environment of a teen, we need to take these things into account. When should I let my child get a cell phone? Well, that largely depends on their maturity level and things. How do they deal with things? How do they deal with emotion? Because you can try to put all of the safeguards on your phone, and child locks and everything else. But trust me, these kids, they're smarter than us nowadays. They know how to unlock that stuff and hide it in a different place. So they're going to be subjective to some of these things that are out on social media. And it's all about, can your brain handle it? So next to infancy, as I mentioned earlier, the adolescent brain goes through the most dynamic rate of development. There are large numbers, think of it like a forest and trees where you have roots coming together that are synapses. So there are a large number of synapses that are gained. And then through what's called synaptic pruning, we're getting rid or cutting out those that we don't need anymore. So during this period, it's a very important time to make sure that we are both protecting our brain and making sure that we're putting it in the right environment. There are a lot of hormonal and biological changes during this time. Puberty introduces these hormonal surges. These surges of these hormones impact your mood, your motivation, your social behavior. And so these changes can amplify or increase your emotional response, and it causes teens to take more risks. They don't really understand the impact of some of these risks or things they're being asked to do, substances, vaping, all those types of things. And that's largely because, again, the area which is the check system of the brain, the frontal lobe, has not fully developed. And when I think about the frontal lobe development, I always think of the story of Phineas Gage. So Phineas Gage, back in the summer of 1948, I think is what the story says, he's a 25-year-old railroad worker in the New England area. And apparently, according to, historical texts that I've seen, he was a church-going guy, family guy, a real well-rounded guy. And he's a railroad worker. So they were blasting through this mountain in the New England area. And some dynamite went off. And it drove a spike up through his cheek, through his left eye, and took out the front part of his brain. But the surprising thing about it is that he actually lived through this. And even after this accident, he would go on road shows with the circus and different things like that, and actually hold up the stake, the piece of metal that went through his skull, through the front part of his face, and through his frontal lobe. But the interesting thing is not that Phineas survived this accident. The interesting thing is how this accident affected his behavior. Because as I mentioned, the stake, the piece of metal, went through his frontal lobe and took out his frontal lobe. Now, again, at this time, he's mid-20s already. So this would have developed, but now this accident has happened that takes out his frontal lobe. And there's a doctor who took care of him, Dr. Harlow. And this is what he wrote about Phineas Gage after the accident. And I got this out of a book called Descartes' Error, which is an excellent book as well. But it says he is now fitful, irrelevant, indulging at times in the grossest profanity, which has not previously been his custom, manifesting but little difference for his fellows, impatient of restraint or advice when it conflicts with his desires, and at times pertinaciously obstinate, devising many plans for the future operations which are no longer arranged than they are abandoned. That sounds like a lot of younger brains that we see nowadays. So, the story of Gage really highlights to me the importance of, what these different areas and not having that frontal lobe, the type of things that it does. So the limbic system develops first, and it is your system that controls emotions, whether you're sad, happy. It's your pleasure and reward system. So the young brain, again, operates mostly on pleasure and reward. But as we grow, that frontal system, that frontal lobe, is more of the check system. So what are some of the factors that influence the maturation of the adolescent brain? Well, there's heredity, there's environment that we talked about before, sex hormones like estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, physical, mental, economic, and psychological status. So kids from abusive homes or who grow up in dire situations, it does have a actual structural effect on the brain, and that's why you can see some later manifestations of different either behavior or psychological issues because of that. Sometimes surgical intervention. Sleep is a big one. I know wholeheartedly a lot of adolescents and teens don't get enough sleep, but sleep is really where the brain really develops, where you get that pruning of the neurons and those synapses coming together. So sleep is very important. Nutritional status, what you eat. Are you providing your brain with the right nourishment, like the vitamins and so forth? Drugs. We have to be very careful about medicating kids while their brains are developing, because certain drugs that we can give in order to help one thing may be affecting the brain. And then drug abuse, like nicotine, vaping, caffeine, alcohol, all of that can have an effect on the developing brain as well. But what we're seeing now is that the adolescent brain is actually getting too much of social media, too much isolation. They don't know how to really communicate. Rather than going out in the community and playing outside, they'd rather sit on the gaming, isolation. And that isolation does not promote the neuron networks to grow. And what the adolescent brain is getting too little of is socialization and exercise and time to themselves for those activities that really help promote brain growth, like reading and learning. And the other big thing is sleep, because sleep, again, is a very pertinent way of really pruning or growing the brain. So to go back to the points in closing that I mentioned earlier, we have to understand how the brain develops over the course of our lives, and that will hopefully help us to understand how to deal with teens and adolescents a little bit different. The teenage brain values emotion over logic. Teens often rely more on the amygdala, which is again that emotional center, than the prefrontal cortex, which is the logic center, the decision-making center, especially when they are under stress. So stress really puts that stress on the brain, and then you go to what you know best, which if your prefrontal cortex is not developed yet, you're not going to go towards logic. You're going to go more towards emotion. So this can lead to impulsive action and difficulty explaining some of their choices after the fact. There's a lot of risk-taking, novelty-seeking during that time as well. And so this is a key area and period in their lives where the brain is really being changed and evolved as well. So while this can lead to challenges with experimenting with substances and so forth, it's also a great time to really foster a lot of growth, creativity, to really build the brain. Teenage brains and teens are biologically driven to connect with their peers, to get social acceptance. There's a lot of peer pressure. I remember once one of the punishments for my daughter said, "We're going to take your phone," and the response, I was very surprised by the response, because when I asked, "Why are you so emotional about the fact that I'm going to take your phone?" and her response, she said, Dad, if I don't have my phone and I can't connect with my friends, then it's almost like I become irrelevant. And I said, oh my goodness, like how did we get to this point where your social interaction and interacting with your people really fosters so much? But when I think about it, that is part of the amygdala, is that you need to connect, you need to have a social acceptance, and there is a lot of peer pressure. So this explains a lot why teens are more vulnerable to mental health challenges. The brain is at this heightened area where they're more sensitive to stress and trauma and negative experiences. So these periods, you see increased anxiety and depression and mental health issues, because they haven't built that resilience, the walls that the frontal lobe help you to develop. They haven't built those buffers in place yet. So they are a little more sensitive to these life challenges, such as trauma and negative experiences. So we have to really promote the role of the environment, supportive relationships, positive activities, really helping the brain to develop, try to minimize those exposures to chronic stress, substance abuse, encourage open communication, validating the emotions, because if you know now that you're more emotionally driven as a kid, most of your thinking is drew off of emotions, then okay, let's validate. I understand, why you think like this and why this must be emotional. But now let me use my frontal cortex and try to help you explain why I'm being more calculated about this and trying to help you to cope with this situation that you're in. So, changing up the framework of how we talk and address the kids, understanding that we have to be more empathetic. We have to be more understanding of what they're going through. We have to recognize that these quote unquote difficult behaviors are often just a reflection of their normal brain development. That is not a fully developed person that's reacting in this disrespectful or defiant way. It's one who's largely driven by their amygdala that's reacting in this way. So, let's validate that, understand that, and then realize that, okay, your frontal lobe hasn't kicked in yet. So you're maybe more emotionally driven, but now let's go back and let me help you to rationalize what you're thinking. It's still important to encourage independence and responsibility in these kids, but, do it in a way where we can encourage them, give them opportunities to make decisions and learn from their mistakes within like a safe boundary as well. We need to support their interests and friendships and be fully understanding that the goal is for them to be more social and to establish friendships and that really helps the brain to develop. Prioritizing sleep, we have to prioritize good nutrition and regular physical activity, again, because all of these things help the brain to grow and develop. So a couple of key points, again, just to take away, is that the adolescent brain and the teen brain has a big impact on behavior. And if we understand how the brain develops from the back to the front, the emotional centers come in front first, and then later on, the check system, the reasoning centers come in last, later in life, around 25 years old. Hopefully this helps us to be a little more patient, a little more empathetic and supportive to our teens, and allowing them to grow and continue this brain develop to become vibrant adults. I would invite listeners to reflect on their own teen years and their relationships when they were teenagers and how they acted, and keep that into account when you think about how you're interacting with teens and young adults nowadays. And because at one point your brain was not fully developed, and you may have made some decisions based on emotion and different things like that. And finally, we need to encourage learning and open conversations about brain health and development. That's why I wanted to do this talk and really put it out there. We don't talk enough. We talk about everything from substances and vaping and alcohol and drug use, and it's just bad. But are we really explaining or have the knowledge to explain why? Because we're trying to be protective of your brain, because certain things haven't developed yet. And if we can cut back or eliminate some of these negative influences on the brain, to give you the best opportunity to really develop that frontal lobe, really allow your brain and those synapses to both come together and to prune away the negative ones that we don't need anymore, and allow your brain and you to develop into a well-rounded adult. Hope you took away something from this episode, and if you like this episode, please download it, share it with other friends, and join us for future episodes of Your Health, Your Wealth.